Welcome to the Health Fix podcast, where Dr. Janine Krause, that's me, gives you, a health junkie, a weekly dose of tools to help you increase your energy and resilience to life's stressors. You to be self-reliant and self-sufficient and being able to make decisions that matter and are for your health and benefit. All right, let's get on with the podcast. Hello there, health junkies. Welcome to another episode of The Health Fix. I'm your host, Dr. Janine Krause, and on today's episode, I'm going to be talking with Leonard Perlmutter, and we're going to be talking about your conscience and what that mind of yours is up to, especially in this day and age where we have a little case of monkey mind for all of us with the unknown, lots of fears out there, and I've been seeing a lot in my office. So, Leonard, this is timely material. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
So a lot of folks take almost a lifetime to really get to know themselves. And in your book, I was looking at the first part of it and going, who am I? And that's a big question that I wish we went more into that in kindergarten or even in preschool. And unfortunately, we end up at, somewhere in the mid 30s, 40s, if we're lucky, going, who the heck am I? And what is my monkey brain really trying to tell me? So that being said, you've had a history of and folks, we're going to be talking about the book, of course, but in particular, he has a great story in the book where he's talking about how he and his wife worked together and how they came to really start to work on their conscious mind. Will you tell us a little bit about how you and your wife came along in terms of learning more about your conscious mind and actually listening to it?
Well, we met. Janice is her name, Janice, and we met in 1971. I was publishing a newspaper at the time in Albany, New York, and she was an artist who was working at Sears, large department store at the time. And I was visiting the offices looking for advertising. And I arrived in the early afternoon, and nobody was in reception. And so I saw there was a long corridor with offices on either side. So I decided just to walk down and see if I could find somebody. And I would poke my head in on one side and then on the other side to another office, but they were all closed. Nobody was home till I arrived at the far end of the hallway, and against a wall in front of an easel was this woman. And I looked at her and I said, "Is there nobody here?" And she looked at me with a very strange, quizzical look in her eye, and she said, "I'm here." So I knew right away that this person had an excellent mind. And she held her ground, and she volleyed the ball back to my court. It's my side of the court. And so my next question was, well, do you have a philosophy of life? And gosh, we started a conversation. And we've been having this conversation every day since 1971 in different forms. But interestingly, each of us in our own lives were looking for somebody to have this conversation, the same kind of conversation that you were inferring in your setup. Previously, both of us in our own worlds, in our own lives, were looking to people like people that we went to school with or college or post-grad schooling. But every time this type of a philosophical question was presented, it was always followed by eyes rolling to the back of the head.
It's true.
And it was, and the conversation was a non-starter. But here I had a human being who was interested in talking, so we started talking. And the more we started talking, we began exploring together and reading. From all different spiritual traditions and religious traditions. And we came to realize that, gosh, this is all yoga and the perennial wisdom from these sages who lived thousands and thousands of years ago. And both of us had physiological issues from eating the standard American diet. So the very first form of yoga science, even before we knew there was really a full-blown science, was the science of Ayurveda, which taught us about our body type and about the mind and about the kinds of food that was best at certain times of day, in certain seasons. And not only was it rewarding, but it was very entertaining, it was a lot of fun, and it was very helpful. We both immediately felt better, and that good feeling encouraged us to continue exploring and continuing to experiment with old habits.
Now, see, I find that absolutely fascinating. And I want folks to really get the concept here of the basics in life really are important. Good food, good water, nature, getting out in the sunlight, those sorts of things to help with our mind, since we are creatures that come from the earth and definitely have a deep connection to the earth. And I love that in your book you talk about, okay, here's how you get to unlock your mind. You help first your body balance and get into balance. And of course you were alluding to Ayurveda with the three doshas and things of that nature. And folks, I have other podcasts, we'll go into that there. This, in terms of this focus, we're going to get into more of the mind in particular. Now, in your book, you mentioned 4 functions of the mind, and the logic and the 5 senses, the ego, and then the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. Now, a lot of folks have come on the podcast, or we've talked about books where we talk about the unconscious mind. Mm-hmm. Would you tell folks a little bit about, and I know this is a huge question, about the 4 functions of the mind and how they intricately relate? Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I only need to start paying attention to my subconscious mind. But it's like, wait a minute, we've got other aspects we need to think about. So tell us a little bit more about those 4.
That's right. We are complicated, complex, holistic organisms. This human being that we find ourselves inhabiting, this mind-body-sense complex. And it's interesting, even when we were younger people and even when we were kids, we sort of intuitively knew that there were different voices in our mind. And it's true, we do have different voices. So there are 4 major voices in our mind, 4 major functions of the mind. And that's critically important because the mind moves first and the body follows. We cannot take an action, I can't raise my hand, without first entertaining a thought. That speaks to the power of the mind and the power of thoughts. But these 4 voices act before we can take an action. And of course, once we take an action, whether it's a verbal action or a physical action, there's always a consequence that's directing us in one direction or another. Generally speaking, we all know the direction we want to go in, and that's for happiness, security, and health. But we don't always get there. And that's because we don't understand the 4 functions of the mind. First of which, I'll say, is ego. Ego is very interesting, very interesting. Now, it's not the same type of an ego that Western psychology talks about, where the individual is puffed up about themselves and they think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. No. Ego is anything that separates me from the truth of who I am. And who is that? Well, I have a body, but I'm not the body. I have a mind and thoughts and desires and emotions, but I am not the mind, because all of those are changing. And yet within me, there is something that never changes, and that is my awareness, my consciousness. the background of all reality. So ego, which is tethered and hardwired to the reptilian brain, is all about self-preservation. And the ego has this fear, this intense fear of annihilation. And so the ego, I imagine the ego walks around all the time, 24/7, with a chainsaw on its hip. And whenever the ego is in the midst of a relationship that requires an action that brings about a consequence, the ego takes out the chainsaw and splits the relationship in half and says, oh, this is pleasant, this is good, let's reprise it. And this portion over here, this is unpleasant, it's bad, let's avoid it. But our limited experience already tells us that that which is pleasant isn't always good for us, and that which is unpleasant isn't always bad for us. Mm-hmm. So if I develop the ego's limited perspective, and note that it's not always wrong, this limited perspective, but a great deal of the time it's wrong. Uh-huh. But if I adopt its philosophy, then I mentally get locked down in things I like and things I don't like. And I want to reprise what I like and I want to avoid what I don't like. That mental inflexibility ultimately creates physical inflexibility, which disallows the body to be nurtured by the energy that is constantly coming to us to maintain the city of life. And instead, we experience dis-ease, pain, or illness. That's the ego. Mm-hmm. Only has a limited perspective. And it's not that it's always wrong. Right now, I need a healthy ego to have this conversation and make sense in this conversation. When I drive an automobile, I need a healthy ego. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to get rid of the ego, which of course is impossible. But we want to expand its awareness, its definition of who it thinks it is. That's ego. Often wrong, but never in doubt. Then there's the senses and logic. The senses and logic always ask the question, should I do it or should I not do it? Should I do it or should I not do it? And the mind continuously, and now where we're at in this history of humanity, we are addicted to the mind extruding our creative energy through the senses, not very differently than when we squeeze a tube of toothpaste to brush our teeth, and out comes the toothpaste. For us, the problem is, if we had to get that toothpaste back in the tube, that would be a difficult situation. Same with our creative energy. Once it goes out through the eyes and the nostrils and the mouth and the ears and the hands and the feet, it's spent. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to be able to recoup it to do something that we really need to do, instead of running after foot-long hot dogs and triple-decker hamburgers, thinking that's going to make me happy and that's going to bring me pleasure. Mm-hmm. So again, the senses are not always wrong. Like everybody, I have a body, I have senses. Life is to be enjoyed, but we need balance and we need discrimination. Otherwise, it's going to be a painful trip. Mm-hmm. So we have the ego, we have the senses and logic. Those are two functions. Third is the unconscious. The unconscious also has a limited perspective, not always wrong. This is the repository to everything that we deem essential to self-preservation. Sometimes there are appropriate, truthful concepts stored in the unconscious mind. A lot of times there are untruthful concepts stored in the unconscious mind. It's a little bit analogous to when we were kids in grade school and we learned in arithmetic that 1 + 2 is 3. So we learned that, and that's on the hard drive now in the unconscious mind. But we've all had teachers who taught us at a very young, impressionable age that 1 plus 2 is 4. Oh, and we're so young and we're so impressionable and we're so needy to be received and accepted, we believe that. I have believed it. And that's on my hard drive too. And in certain kinds of relationships, when my emotional buttons are pushed, my go-to concept is 1 plus 2 equals 4. And what happens as a result? Oh, I wind up in pain. Not only that, but I cause pain to other people. Mm-hmm. So you have the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind, all with limited perspectives, sometimes accurate, a lot of times not, but they are counselors. They're counselors. They're constantly advising, and they're sort of like lobbyists. Mm-hmm. Now, the fourth function of the mind is your conscience. Your conscience is very interesting. It is the only function of the mind that can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide. That is very important. And what that means initially is every single choice that we have ever made in our lives and every choice we will ever make in our life is always made by the conscience. The other functions of the mind can only operate as advisors. Okay? So the truth is that the conscience is unique because it acts as a mirror, and it can reflect perfect wisdom from the superconscious portion of the mind. Oh, we never learned about the superconscious portion of the mind. What is that? Where is that? Well, it's beyond the conscious portion. It's beyond the unconscious portion. It's actually at the center of consciousness itself. This intuitive library of wisdom that resides all the way at the core of our being, what religionists refer to as our soul. But words are just pointers. They're an attempt by one human being to communicate a concept to another human being. Mm-hmm. So the conscience has the capacity to reflect wisdom from the superconscious portion of the mind. Now, this superconscious portion of the mind is not just an illusion. It's the same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein saw mathematical equations. It's the same portion of the mind where Paul McCartney hears beautiful melodies. Doesn't mean I'm going to become a songwriter, and it doesn't mean that you're going to become a physicist.
Absolutely not.
But what it does mean is that the more that we can use the conscience to reflect this superconscious wisdom and employ it through our thoughts, words, and deeds, we will be more creative within the constellation of relationships that we have. So, what happens is that the ego, senses, and unconscious mind are so certain and so powerful of a voice, it diminishes the capacity of the conscience to reflect wisdom from the superconscious portion of the mind. It's the standard problem that engineers have in trying to accentuate the signal in the face of a lot of noise. And that's what's happening here. The noise of the ego, senses, and unconscious mind is so overwhelming and uncoordinated and anarchistic because we have let it to be so, that the conscience cannot reflect wisdom from the superconscious mind. So therefore, the conscience, which is the only function of the mind that can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide, will do so based on limited, often faulty input from the ego, senses, and unconscious mind. Gotcha. And that's the human condition today.
I I would wholeheartedly agree that we have too much noise, external, internal, and we don't know how to slow down to be able to get to go, okay, let's weigh out all of the voices and then come to a very good decision. Now, I think a lot of people might be listening right now and going, okay, Leonard, how the heck do I slow down? What types of things can I do? And we spoke to the basics, good food, good water, things of that nature. What else might you suggest for folks who are going, okay, I've got a lot of noise in my life. How do I eliminate some of this? How do I tap into my conscience?
Okay, it's critically important that we stay with the mind, because the mind's the problem and the mind's the solution. We don't want to go outside. We don't want to talk about food. We don't want to talk about slowing down. We don't want to talk about lifestyle changes until we can coordinate the mind and get that straight, because
Okay.
that's the key. So what I do is I make an appointment. I set an appointment. Yeah. And I bring together the ego, the senses, the unconscious mind, and the conscience, and we all sit around the kitchen table.
Nice.
And I'm sort of, I'm the director here. And I say, look, we have a situation here. We have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. Ego, you have the floor. What's your perspective? And the ego will tell us what his perspective is. And this is very pleasant, and it's not unpleasant. I really would like to see us do this, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Senses, what do you say? I'm with the ego. I think that's a great idea. I'm for the pleasant. In fact, right now, I'm not interested in brushing my teeth. I'd rather have a second slice of apple pie. And okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And now, unconscious, what do you say? Oh, I'm with the other two. Okay, thank you. All right, now, the three of you, let's sit down quietly because we're going to listen to the conscience. What do you say about this issue about, am I going to brush my teeth? Am I not going to brush my teeth after this meal? And so the conscience, in a very deliberative manner, says, look, we are not in a sprint as human beings. This is a long-distance run. This is a marathon. We need healthy, strong teeth. We need healthy, strong gums. We need healthy, strong immune system. And the brushing of the teeth is a small investment in that health. So why don't we just take a little break and do an experiment together? And then we'll come right back to the kitchen table and we'll find out how we felt. So we all go and we brush our teeth, and then we come back to the kitchen table. Ego, how do you feel now that we experimented with something relatively easy? Well, it was easier than I thought it was going to be, the ego says, and it was quite enjoyable. Senses? Oh, you know what I really like when the tongue rolls over my teeth? I don't feel that mossy feeling. It feels clean. I like that, the senses says. And the unconscious mind says, well, I have to agree. It wasn't so bad. It wasn't so bad. Now we have something. We have a little beachhead where the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind gave up the ground upon which they stood. They all experienced some form of death, which is not annihilation. They're still here. It's just change and growth. So they all no longer have this limited perspective. They have this perspective. And if I can continue to do small, seemingly insignificant experiments with them and bring them along, step by step, they will experience a pleasant experiment, and they will trust me that I am not going to bring about some form of annihilation to their identity. but rather expanded.
That's fascinating in terms of a couple different things. One, I think a lot of people will also try to go to the food, the water, and all of that first, and try to do that, and they'll come back in my office and be like, "Doc, I'm overwhelmed. I can't handle this." And then giving every little piece of that, the monkey brain, as I'll call it, and the four different parts of the brain in that case, it does give it some really nice opportunity to learn a little bit about who you are as a whole. So it's much like the concept of what folks talk about when they're talking about rewiring of sort.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, we're re-engineering the software of the mind. That's what we're doing. It's an engineering science. The whole thing is an engineering science. You know, these channels through which consciousness flows, all these thoughts that we have every day, that we had yesterday, it's because these deep channels in the unconscious mind. And what we're doing is we're rewriting that software. We're changing the topography of the unconscious mind. So consciousness can flow through new, healthy channels rather than these old, habituated, unhelpful channels.
Exactly. So someone might be thinking, Leonard, going, all right, how many experiments can I do in a day? What have you found in terms of what's realistic for folks? What's, kind of been your experience as a whole in terms of trying these experiments out?
I say, initially, look for easy things to work with. If you have a situation where the body is carrying too much weight and you're thinking that, well, maybe I shouldn't have this next cookie, and you're not ready, the ego senses and unconscious mind is not willing to give it up, ask them if they're willing to give up a half a cookie or a quarter of a cookie just for the sake of an experiment. If it's 10 o'clock at night, you're just trying to relax a little bit before retiring to sleep, and there's a coffee commercial that comes on the telly, and the ego senses and unconscious mind immediately want to rush to the kitchen to have coffee, sugar, half and half, and maybe a leftover slice of the apple pie that we had for dinner.
This sounds kind of familiar here.
Right. Okay, so the ego has its say, the senses have their say, the unconscious mind has its say, and then the conscience says, 10 o'clock at night is not really a good time for caffeinated coffee. If we have this conversation early in the morning, hey, I might have a different recommendation for you. Let's do an experiment. So how many can you fit in during a day, during a week? Don't take on too much too soon. If you've never lifted weights to build muscles, and you're in the afternoon of life and you start thinking, well, maybe I ought to start lifting weights, the last thing you want to do is to go to a gym and start picking up 100 pounds or 200 pounds. It would injure you. So you start with something easy, a pound, 2 pounds, 5 pounds. And within a couple of weeks, a couple of months, you'll be lifting more and more substantial weight, and you won't injure yourself. That's the key. Non-injury, non-harming. Don't take on too much too soon. Learn to love yourself.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's brilliant to say that, because I think a lot of people do try to take on too much too soon. And then this is where failure kind of comes in. And now we're blaming the diet or the protocol or whatever it may be. And unfortunately, it does go back to us and how we process things. Now, in your book, you mentioned something that really kind of hit home for me in terms of talking about self-reliance and talking about the responsibility. And this concept is, for me, probably one of the most crucial things that if I can impart on any of my patients is reliance and trusting themselves and knowing that you are responsible for yourself. Can you speak a little bit more to this concept and where you were going with that in the book in particular? And am I interpreting it the correct way here?
I think so. I think so. My teacher, Swami Rama of the Himalayas, always said that we are the architects of our lives. We determine our destiny. So I have never made a living teaching people to meditate. My wife is an artist, and I have represented her and her paintings since the 1970s. That's how I make a living. I'm an art dealer. And I once went to a teacher in California, Eknath Easwaran. I had been reading his books and very interested in them. And I said to him, I love this yoga science, but I think that probably it's better designed for people who, say, work for the government. They have a paycheck coming in every week. They have a retirement plan, pension, health insurance. I have none of these. And so I have to deal with a lot of fear. I'm self-employed, you know. And he looked at me and he said, Leonard, you consider yourself self-employed. I'm employed by the self. And a light goes on in my mind. Easwaran said that he's employed by the self. That means the wisdom reflected by the conscience. This superconscious wisdom is my higher self. So, since that time, in the late 1970s, I have stopped being self-employed. And I have tried to the best of my ability to become employed by my inner wisdom. And I have tried in every relationship, before I take an action, before I speak a word, even before I continue to think a thought, I try to go within. Ask the conscience to reflect wisdom from the superconscious mind and advise me. Is this the thought to think? Is this the word to speak? Is this the action to take? And I've experimented with that over and over and over again, even in the midst of intense fear, even when driving an automobile and somebody cuts me off in traffic and I have to slam on the brake in order to avoid an accident, and from the unconscious mind comes a flood of anger. Even in the face of that, I seek a higher perspective to know how I am going to use this energy that's coming to me. How am I going to use this anger? I mean, anger is what? It's just energy. Fear is what? It's just energy. And what do we know about energy? Well, we learned in 5th grade that energy can't be created, it can't be destroyed, but it can be transformed. Can be transformed. I can transform ice into water, and I can transform water into steam. Well, what about fear? What about anger? What about greed? If we have lots of that, and we all do, it means we're wealthy. It's like discovering a gold mine or an oil well in our backyard. But what we need is some form of refinery, a refining capacity to transform it from a contractive and debilitating and pernicious form of energy like fear and anger and selfish desire, which only poisons my entire physiology. I can transform it into healing energy, an increase in willpower, and an increase in my access to superconscious wisdom. In other words, I become more creative simply by sacrificing that energy, offering it back to the origin from which it came. So the word sacrifice comes from the Latin, sacrifici, same in Italian. It means to make it sacred. Everything is a gift, including the fear, including the anger, including the self-willed desire. But if I can sacrifice it, my outer actions are in harmony with my inner wisdom, and on the very subtle, transcendent level, that contractive energy that can harm me can be transformed in a way it can benefit me, and I can access it. And the more that I do that, I become more self-confident, which flies in the face of our culture, doesn't it? Because the culture is encouraging us to look outside for the experts, rather than to be self-reliant. Absolutely. And the more that I am self-reliant, relying on my higher self, this wisdom reflected by my conscience, I am not only self-reliant, but I am able to respond in a variety of situations that I never could respond to skillfully. So I become responsible. I have responsibility. I have the ability to respond in a skillful way as opposed to a habitual way of responding.
I like that. I like how the words play out there, which gives us kind of great freedom in terms of our ability to be responsible, but also in our ability to choose our thoughts, choose our direction, choose however we want to think.
So that begs the question, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. That begs the question, and a good one. How free do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And how free do human beings really want to be? I know what they say, but Jesus says, you shall know them by their fruits. Show me the action.
Yes.
Right? Show me the action. What are they really doing? So people say they want to be free. They yell and scream to be free. But when push comes to shove, when they have the opportunity, when somebody cuts me off in traffic and I'm dealing with anger, how free am I then?
Trapped yourself.
Right. And whose concept was that to retaliate? Maybe it was my father's. Maybe it was my mother's. Maybe it was my grandmother's. Maybe it was my grandfather's. Right? Maybe it was some movie that I saw, a celebrity acting that way when somebody cut them off in traffic. So then, whose life am I living? And why?
This is true. Learned behavior.
Yeah.
Comes from subconscious there. And ego. I guess that's ego, sense. I mean, all of it, really, if you put it together, except for the conscious, because you have to make the decision there.
Right.
Yeah. That begs back to the original question of who am I? Whose life am I leading?
That's right. That's right. So it goes back, who am I? Who is aware of all these things? Mm-hmm. I mean, I have a body, but am I the body? And if I'm the body, which body am I? Am I this body in the afternoon of life? Or am I that 5-year-old body? So the body is a process. It's not a thing. It's not me. And as far as the mind is concerned, people that identify with the mind and our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, it's impossible to say that I'm an emotion. When I'm cut off in traffic and anger comes forward from the unconscious mind, what do I say? Oh, I'm angry. That's an oxymoron. It's impossible for me to be angry. It's impossible for me to be anger. That's an emotion. I'm aware of anger. I have a relationship with anger. I have to deal with it. I have to take an action, but I am not it. But we identify. Mm-hmm. I had a very close relative once. He had lower back pain. I too had lower back pain as a young person. I held and deposited a majority of my fear in my lower back, and it caused lower back contraction. It's a true story. True story. So I said to him, look, I did some easy gentle yoga. I began working with my conscience, and I don't have that pain anymore. I know that you don't have an operable condition, which is fairly similar to mine. Would you like me to teach some things to you? And his response was very poignant. Of course, it brought a smile to my face because he was sarcastic, but It brought a smile with a tear rolling down the cheek. His response was, if I didn't have the pain in my back, how would I know who I was?
And this is a very huge concept for a lot of folks that I see in my office working with chronic pain.
Right.
It's a big, huge concept.
That's right.
Yeah. And it does bring a tear. It's
Yes.
sad to be like, wait, who would you be without that? Wait a minute here. Who could you be without it?
So in that case, my teacher, Swami Rama, he would shake his head back and forth and put his hand to his chest and say, "Oh, human being. Oh, human being. Oh, human being. You have potential to create a beautiful work of art. Don't let the music die within inside of you. Bring it out so that the world can hear this music, or see this beautiful work of art. We're all looking for you to bring it forward. We say we have all these challenges and all these problems, but gosh, we have no idea how creative we could possibly be if we just let the conscience be our guide and coordinate the functions of the mind just for the sake of an experiment. I'm the first one that would say, continue being a doubting Thomas. I'm a doubting Thomas. I'm not a fool. I'm not going to be told by anybody. And I have no intention to convince anybody of anything. But if they're interested in what I'm saying and what is being taught or that they read, then I say, test it. Make an experiment of it so that you can test it and experience the truth for yourself. Mm-hmm. That's the highest knowledge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is a perfect way to kind of wrap up our conversation today in terms of folks. You've listened to Leonard and I talk back and forth about how to work on your conscious, how to really be aware of your conscience, and how it just takes some experiments and just one step at a time. Now, of course, your book enlightens us much deeper than this conversation as to how to carry out those experiments, the nuts and bolts of things. Now, Leonard, where can folks find the book online, and where can we find you online to be able to get more information from you?
Well, thank you. Any fine bookseller will have Your Conscience. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore either has it or can order it. The book itself, Your Conscience, has a website with information. It's yourconscience.org. Yourconscience.org. And as far as I'm concerned, if people want to find me and the teaching that I do, I teach through the American Meditation Institute. And the American Meditation Institute website is americanmeditation.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leonard, for coming on. This is fabulous. You're supporting a great mission here for folks to unlock their potential in their conscious mind and really obtain the freedom that they keep talking about wanting and really accessing it. So, folks, you've survived another episode of The Health Fix. I hope you guys have a great day, whatever you're doing.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Fix podcast. This podcast was brought to you by Blue Blocks, the blue light blocking glasses. If you follow me on Instagram, you will see me wearing my computer glasses. Those are the Galaxy version. They're fabulous. I have not been having headaches in my office thanks to those awful overhead lights that we have. Those buggers are blah. So anyway, blue light blocking glasses, game changers for your health. Check out them at blueblocks.com.